Out came out, I think about 10 years ago now, the original Inside Out. Maybe you've seen trailers for Inside Out 2 that's supposed to be coming to theaters soon. But the original Inside Out features a variety of characters that are supposed to represent our emotions. Sometime in the early middle of the 20th century, psychologist Paul Eckhart came up with the idea that we have at basic 6 human emotions. If you know the Inside Out characters, you already know most of them. We have joy, sadness, disgust, anger. Eckhart says surprise. Surprise doesn't show up in the Inside Out film. And what am I missing? Fear. Joy, sadness, disgust, anger, fear, and surprise. Basically just 5 or 6 human emotions. I can say that still because Inside Out 2 hasn't been released yet. And that's when they're adding more emotions. Actually, my friends and colleagues in the CTS School of Counseling would tell me there's actually something closer to like 28 human emotions, but we don't have time for that. So I want to think about those basic emotions for a moment. In John's gospel, of all the gospel accounts, Jesus is perhaps the most human. Now that's weird for me to say because in other ways, John proclaims Jesus as the most divine, doing these great miracles, clearly named as the great I am. The language used in the Hebrew Bible for God, God's self. Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, but at the same time, in John's Gospel, Jesus is also the most human. And so in these days, as we lead up to Jesus' death on the cross, as we journey with Jesus into Jerusalem and experience those moments right before he knew that he would need to die, we get a taste of some of Jesus' humanity, of his wrestling with these basic human emotions. Last week, when Jesus asked his disciples who he was, and Peter proclaimed that he was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, we saw in Jesus joy. And maybe it's one of those other 28, a bit of perhaps pride in his disciples who had gotten it right. But then instantly surprise, disappointment, maybe even disgust, when Peter, who had just confessed him as the living Christ, didn't understand that the living Christ would need to die on the cross to do the work that God had given him to do. Next week, preview, we will see Jesus weeping on the hills outside of Jerusalem as a mother weeps for her children, experiencing the sadness that comes with knowing all of the ways in which we haven't yet gotten it right. Not then, not 2,000 years later, now. But today we engage perhaps the most notorious human emotion of all. Today, as Jesus goes into the temple to worship and encounters, as he always would have from the time that he was a small boy, the money-changing tables, the tables to purchase animals for offering or to exchange your Roman coins for a Jewish coin, a shekel that could be given as offering in the temple. Today, we get a taste of what it means for Jesus to experience anger, even rage. Now, what was going on? What pushed his button, if you imagine the little console in the Disney Inside Out movement? What pushed his button to give anger control in that moment? Here it's important to understand a little bit of the history of the temple system. Because it isn't that Jesus was angry about the ways in which his fellow Jews were engaging in worship. In fact, it isn't even that Jesus was the only Jew who might have been a bit disgusted or enraged by the ways in which these tables were set up in the temple. What upset Jesus, what triggered his anger, was the ways in which the Jewish traditions and culture, the sacred practice of offering and worship and sacrifice, was being distorted for the Roman system of power. Now remember, I said these were money-changing tables. I hope that maybe some of you are planning on giving an offering in a little while when we pass the plates or put that QR code up for Good Sam's. But you might have noticed there wasn't anybody standing at the doors as you came in offering to exchange your United States currency for Episcopalian tokens that you could then deposit in the offering plate. Maybe we should. I mean, the United States currency has images of human beings on it. It has on it printed the words, "In God we trust," which raises all kinds of interesting questions about the separation of church and state and what it means to practice our religion freely. But we don't. We give our offerings from the money and the gifts and the talents that we have and that we live in this world for all its foibles that we happen to inhabit. That is how the Jewish people practiced their offerings and sacrifices for millennia as well. They gave their ordinary currency, the shekels that were being produced and used in the economy and the marketplace everywhere, until Rome took control of the area surrounding Jerusalem, of the region of Judea. And when Rome took control of Judea, then Rome imposed the Roman coins on the people who lived in that region. And like our dollar bills and coins that have images of human beings, the Roman coins had images of the emperors. And as if that weren't bad enough for good practicing Jewish people who were commanded by God never to make a graven image of anyone, these same emperors claimed to be the sons of the gods. Those who spoke and had the authority of the pagan deities, who Jesus and all of his countrymen, all of his family and cousins, those with whom he worshiped, understood to be in opposition to the one true God of Israel. But they wanted to eat. So when they were out in the markets, they would use their Roman currency. They would purchase food. They would purchase the things that they needed. They would pay their taxes with these Roman coins. And yet when they came to the temple, it would have been blasphemy against God to make an offering with a coin with the image of Caesar. And so they set up money-changing tables, where you could change that Roman coin that was good in the marketplace for the equivalent of an Episcopalian token. A worthless shekel that could not be used outside of the temple, but that allowed those in the temple to make an offering to God without violating the commandment against graven images. I don't think Jesus had anything against the Jewish people sitting at those tables trading Roman coins for shekels. I don't think Jesus had anything against the good Jewish people who were coming into the temple ready to make their offerings in earnest to God. I don't even think he had anything against the birds who were set up ready to be purchased for sacrifice. But, as happens with anger sometimes, when Jesus walked into the temple once again, seeing the ways in which the systems of this world, the powers of Rome, those whom he was daily preaching and teaching against, had overtaken not just the marketplaces, weren't just causing the people who could barely scratch out enough food for a living to have to pay more taxes outside the temple, but had also managed to pervert the leaders and the practices of the temple itself, he became angry. And what do we do when we're angry? We have different emotional responses. Oftentimes, when I'm angry, I will storm off and slam a door, go hide and be someplace by myself where I can cool down. My first memory of doing that was actually in church. I had been making too much noise, playing with my dolls or something during the early part of the worship service, and my mother had been repeatedly telling me that if I didn't quiet down, I would be going to the nursery. I'm not even sure she intended that as a threat. I was like 3 or 4 years old, so it probably would have been a lot of fun in the nursery. But I heard it as a threat, and so my defenses went up. And so then when my mother went to grab my elbow to lead me somewhere, I was certain we were going to the nursery, and I became angry and upset, and I hid under the chair and held on for dear life. The rest of my family got up and went where my mother wanted us to go, which happened to be communion. I missed that moment. They came back, and I, in that privacy of everybody else in my row being gone for a little bit, had the opportunity to cool down. But as we're even younger than that, often sort of our primal instinct isn't to flee, but is to fight. And so I have memories, not of myself, I can't remember back that far, but I have memories of my children when they were just infants, crying and screaming and inconsolable because I was surely not doing the right thing, throwing the pacifier that I was trying to stick into their mouth right back at me. I'm convinced this is why we buy small infants stuffed, soft things to put in their cribs and their playpens, because there is a human tendency when we are upset, when we are angry and nobody seems to get or understand why, to push back, to topple tables over, throw useless coins against the wall because we've just had enough. My gosh, if you've been reading the news the past week, maybe you've wanted to tip some tables over. School bullying that leads to child deaths. War that leads to genocide. Kidnapping of innocent people and children. Human trafficking. Climate change that has catastrophic impacts for glaciers and whole systems of life. The list can go on. And then, when we think we might be getting somewhere, moving the dial forward just a little bit, we get the news that that horrendous state bill that Indiana passed endangering trans children and their families, that the ACLU had managed to block, has now by a federal court been allowed to go into effect. We see the latest death tolls in Ukraine, in Gaza. As I was reading the gospel text earlier this week, alongside my news feed, I wanted to push some tables over as well, to rail against the powers that be, the systems and structures that continue to do harm to real people who are just trying to live their lives, to purchase enough food for their families, to attain the health care that they need. Anger is a powerful human emotion. So thanks be to God that Jesus is not only human. In our gospel reading today, we read and experience Jesus right alongside of us, weeping and screaming and even throwing things. But that is not the end of John's story. Once Jesus leaves the temple, he doesn't make a plan to come back the next day and tip those tables over one more time. or the next week and keep tipping them over, because I promise you, just as soon as he left the tables, they were righted and the exchange continued. When Jesus leaves the temple, he recognizes what God is calling him to do. Not just to push a few tables over in anger, to throw a few coins, or yell at a few people who can't do anything about the systems that have enmeshed them in this moment in time, from which they may feel there is no escape. No, instead, Jesus begins to plan the escape. When Jesus leaves the temple after his anger has begun to level out, maybe one of those other 27 human emotions might be reason. Certainly, I know that one of those other emotions is compassion. Because Jesus regroups. He reminds his disciples of that which God has called them and us to continue in the midst of all odds to the contrary. To continue proclaiming the love and justice of a God who does not bow to the emperor, who does not bow to the systems of power that would seek to oppress, that would seek to change the ways in which we worship, the ways in which we even pray, but instead proclaims a God of love and justice in the face of oppression, a God of compassion and mercy in the face of violence and death. The change is incremental. The steps are sometimes very small. But this Lenten season and throughout our lives, as we seek to do that which God has given to us, we are called to step forward nonetheless, to carry our crosses, to proclaim the good news of a God whose light shines even in the darkness, who is entirely human with us, but also divine, and so able to give us hope where the systems of humanity may fail. Amen.